The gunshot echoed across the Kansas prairie as Katherine Nash crumpled to the ground, her body hitting the dust with a sickening thud. Blood seeped through her fingers as she clutched her side, the world around her growing dim as hoarse hooves thundered away. She was certain these were her final moments left to die alone on the outskirts of Hays City in the summer of 1875. Katherine struggled to keep her eyes open, watching through blurred vision as the three riders who had ambushed her disappeared into the distance. They had taken everything: her horse, her supplies, the money she had saved for nearly 2 years. Worse still, they had taken her future. At 22, she had traveled all the way from Boston with dreams of starting a new life, teaching in a frontier town where education was scarce. Now she would become just another unmarked grave in the vast Kansas landscape. As consciousness began to fade, a shadow fell across her face. Through the haze of pain, she made out the silhouette of a man against the setting sun. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of a worn cowboy hat. "Miss." His voice was deep, concerned. "Can you hear me?" Katherine tried to respond, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. The stranger knelt beside her, gently moving her hand to examine her wound. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so weathered. "You've been shot," he stated plainly, "but you're still breathing." He paused, his eyes a startling blue that reminded Katherine of the Massachusetts sky meeting hers. "And that's enough for me." The last thing Katherine remembered before darkness claimed her was being lifted into strong arms, the scent of leather and horses filling her nostrils, and the steady heartbeat of the stranger against her cheek. When Katherine awoke, it was to unfamiliar surroundings. She lay on a narrow bed in what appeared to be a small cabin. Sunlight streamed through a single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. Her side throbbed dully, and when she attempted to sit up, pain shot through her torso. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came that same deep voice from the doorway. The man who had found her stepped into the room, carrying a steaming cup. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and those remarkable blue eyes. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck. "Where am I?" Katherine managed, her throat dry and voice raspy. "My ranch, about 15 miles outside of Hays City," he replied, moving to help her sit up slightly before offering the cup. "It's just water with some willow bark. Help with the pain." Katherine accepted it gratefully, studying her savior as she sipped the bitter liquid. "You saved my life. Found you just in time," he said simply. "Name's Preston Foster. Most folks call me Prees." "Katherine Nash," she replied. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Foster. Just Foster is fine." He pulled a chair beside the bed. "Doc Simmons came by yesterday, said you were lucky bullet went clean through without hitting anything vital. Still, you lost a good amount of blood. You'll need to rest for a while." "Yesterday." Katherine's eyes widened. "How long have I been here?" 3 days now," Preston answered. "You've been drifting in and out. Fever broke last night, thankfully." Katherine closed her eyes, remembering the attack. "They took everything. My horse, my trunk with all my possessions. I had just arrived on the stage to Hays City when they offered to escort me to my boarding house, claiming it wasn't safe for a woman alone." Preston's jaw tightened. "Sounds like the Carver brothers and their cousin. They prey on newcomers, especially women. Sheriff knows about them but hasn't been able to catch them yet." "I was to be the new schoolteacher," Katherine said softly. "I had a letter of appointment and everything." "Hays City's been waiting for a teacher for months," Preston said. "School's been sitting empty since Miss Abernathy left last winter." "It doesn't matter now," Katherine replied, fighting back tears. "I have nothing. No clothes beyond what I'm wearing, no teaching materials, no money." She glanced down, realizing for the first time that she was wearing a man's shirt over her undergarments. Heat flooded her cheeks. "Your dress was ruined," Preston explained quickly. "Mrs. Halloway, she helps around the ranch, cleaned you up and changed you. I didn't." He cleared his throat. "Your modesty is intact, Miss Nash." "Thank you," Katherine whispered, embarrassment mingling with gratitude. "As for the rest," Preston continued, "we can sort that out once you're stronger. The important thing is you're alive." Katherine nodded, suddenly exhausted from the short conversation. As her eyes grew heavy, she heard Preston rise from the chair. "Rest now. he said quietly. "You're safe here." Over the next few days, Catherine's strength slowly returned. Mrs. Halloway, a kind widow in her 50s, visited daily to check on her wound and help her bathe. Preston kept his distance during these times, but he would bring meals and sit with Catherine afterward, telling her about his ranch and life in Hays City. She learned that he had come to Kansas 5 years earlier after serving briefly in the Army. With savings from his military pay, he had purchased a small parcel of land and slowly built it into a modest cattle ranch. He lived alone save for 2 ranch hands who stayed in the bunkhouse and Mrs. Halloway who rode out from town 3 times a week. "Don't you get lonely out here?" Catherine asked one evening as they sat on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in hues of orange and pink. She had been able to walk short distances for the past 2 days, though the effort still tired her. Preston considered her question, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've got my horses, the cattle, enough work to fill the days. Town's not so far if I need company." "Still," Catherine pressed, "it seems a solitary life." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Says the woman who came all the way from Boston to Kansas on her own." "That's different," she protested. "I was to have lodgings in town, colleagues, students, and you still will," Preston said firmly. "I rode into town yesterday, spoke with the mayor. The position is still yours if you want it." Catherine stared at him in disbelief. "But I have nothing to offer now. No references, no, I vouched for you," Preston interrupted, "and they're desperate for a teacher. School term is supposed to start in 3 weeks." Hope fluttered in Catherine's chest, but reality quickly dampened it. "Even if they would still have me, I have no place to stay, no clothes, nothing to my name. The teaching position comes with a small house behind the schoolhouse. As for clothes and such, the ladies of the town are already organizing donations. News travels fast in Hays City, especially news of a brave young teacher who survived being shot and left for dead." Catherine's eyes welled with tears. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Preston shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "It's what anyone would do." "No," Catherine shook her head. "It isn't. Most would have ridden past or at best delivered me to the town doctor and been done with it. You've opened your home to me, cared for me, and now you're helping me rebuild my life." For a long moment Preston was silent, his eyes still fixed on the darkening horizon. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "6 years ago, during my last deployment with the Army, I was wounded in a skirmish with raiders. My patrol moved on, thinking I was dead. A Cheyenne family found me, brought me to their camp, healed me. They didn't have to help a white soldier, but they did." He turned to look at her. "I swore then that I'd never pass by someone in need, not if I could help." The simple honesty in his words touched Catherine deeply. Before she could respond, he stood abruptly. "It'll be dark soon, you should rest." He offered his arm to help her rise, and Catherine took it, aware of the strength in his frame as he steadied her. Their eyes met briefly before Preston looked away, a flush coloring his tanned cheeks. That night, Catherine lay awake long after the oil lamp had been extinguished, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night. She thought of Preston Foster, of his quiet strength and unexpected kindness. In the few days she had known him, he had shown more genuine character than most men she had met in her entire life in Boston. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting, because she knew instinctively that she could trust him. Unsettling, because of the way her heart had begun to quicken when he entered a room, the way she found herself watching his hands as he spoke, the way his rare smile seemed to warm her from within. Such feelings were dangerous, Catherine reminded herself sternly. She had come west to be independent, to build a life of her own making. Developing an attachment to the first kind man she encountered was not part of that plan. Besides, in another week or 2, she would be recovered enough to move to town and begin her teaching duties. Their paths would naturally separate. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness, and Catherine turned restlessly in the narrow bed. It was just gratitude she was feeling, she told herself. Nothing more. The next morning, Preston announced that he needed to ride into town for supplies and would be bringing back some things for Catherine. "Mrs. Halloway mentioned you might appreciate some proper clothing," he said, not quite meeting her eyes over breakfast. She's arranged with the dressmaker to have some ready-made items set aside. If you'll tell me your preferences, I'll do my best. Katherine smiled at his obvious discomfort with the subject of women's clothing. Anything practical will do, perhaps a skirt and blouses. And I would be eternally grateful for a nightgown that isn't quite so. She gestured at the oversized shirt she had been sleeping in. Preston nodded quickly, his ears reddening. I'll see to it. After he departed, Mrs. Holloway helped Katherine wash her hair and bind her wound with fresh bandages. That man, Mrs. Holloway said as she combed through Katherine's long chestnut hair, has not had a woman in this house since I've known him. 5 years, and not so much as a social call from a lady. I'm hardly a social call, Katherine pointed out. More an unwanted burden, Mrs. Holloway snorted. If you were unwanted, he'd have dropped you at Doc Simmons' office and been done with it. Instead, he's hardly left the ranch since bringing you here, and I catch him pacing outside this door like a nervous father when you're sleeping. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. He's simply being kind. Preston Foster is a good man, but he's not one for charity cases, Mrs. Holloway continued, sectioning Katherine's hair to braid it. He keeps to himself, does his work, helps when needed but doesn't get involved in others' affairs. Yet here you are in his home wearing his shirt, and he's riding into town to buy you dresses. You make it sound as though I'm just saying, Mrs. Holloway interrupted with a knowing smile. That man hasn't looked at a woman the way he looks at you since I've known him, and I've known him since he first came to these parts. Katherine didn't know how to respond. She couldn't deny that something about Preston drew her, but surely it was simply the circumstances of their meeting. She was vulnerable, he was her rescuer. Such dynamics often created confused emotions. I'll be gone from here soon enough, Katherine said finally. Once I'm well, I'll be living in town and teaching at the school. Mrs. Holloway tied off the braid with a ribbon and patted Katherine's shoulder. We'll see, dear, we'll see. Preston returned late that afternoon, his horse laden with parcels. To Katherine's surprise, he had not only brought several simple dresses, skirts, and blouses as requested, but also a pair of sturdy boots, stockings, a warm shawl, and even a small selection of hair ribbons. The dressmaker insisted, he said gruffly when Katherine exclaimed over the ribbons. Said no young lady should be without such things. It's too much, Katherine protested as she examined the clothes. I can't possibly repay you for all this. You'll receive a small salary as teacher, Preston replied. You can repay me then if it makes you feel better. Though it's not necessary. Katherine ran her hand over the soft wool of a russet-colored dress. It had been ages since she'd had new clothes, having made do with altering her mother's old gowns after her parents died. These simple frontier styles were a far cry from the fashions of Boston, but they were well made and practical. Thank you, she said simply, looking up to find Preston watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, neither spoke. Mayor said the school needs work before term starts, Preston finally said, breaking the silence. Roof leaks, some windows broken. I offered to help with repairs. That's very kind of you, Katherine replied. Thought you might want to see it before you start teaching there. Once you're stronger, I could take you into town. The prospect of leaving the ranch gave Katherine mixed feelings. On one hand, she was eager to see the school to begin preparations for teaching. On the other, the ranch had become a safe haven, and the thought of facing the town after her ordeal was daunting. I'd like that, she said finally. Perhaps next week, if Dr. Simmons thinks I'm ready, Preston nodded. He'll be out to check on you day after tomorrow. We'll ask him then. The doctor pronounced Katherine's recovery remarkable 2 days later and gave his permission for a short trip to town, provided she didn't overexert herself. The wound is healing nicely, he told Preston as they stood on the porch after examining Katherine. She's young and healthy, which helps. Still, she needs another week or two of rest before taking up full duties. She'll have it, Preston assured him. I won't let her push too hard. Dr. Simmons smiled knowingly. I don't doubt that. Half the town is talking about how Preston Foster finally found himself a woman. Preston's face darkened. It's not like that. She was injured, needed help. And you've been caring for her for nearly 2 weeks now, the doctor countered. Can't blame folks for wondering, especially given your usual solitary ways. Well, they can stop wondering, Preston said firmly. Miss Nash will be taking up her position as teacher as soon as she's able. End of story. The doctor raised his hands in surrender. No need to get riled up, just telling you what's being said. He gathered his medical bag. Bring her to town tomorrow if the weather holds, short visit only. She can meet some of the townsfolk, see the school, then straight back here to rest. After the doctor left, Preston remained on the porch, staring out at his land with a furrowed brow. Katherine, who had overheard portions of the conversation from the open window, felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and something else she couldn't quite name. The idea that people thought she and Preston were involved was mortifying. What must they think of her, staying unchaperoned in a bachelor's home? Yet she also felt an unexpected pang at Preston's emphatic denial. Of course, he was right to set the record straight, but his vehemence suggested the very idea was distasteful to him. Katherine shook her head at her own foolishness. It shouldn't matter what Preston Foster thought of her beyond basic human decency. Soon enough, she would be established in town, teaching the children of Hayes City, building the independent life she had dreamed of. Preston would return to his solitary existence on the ranch, and their paths would cross only occasionally, as was proper. Still, as she tried on one of the new dresses Mrs. Halloway had helped alter to fit her, Katherine couldn't help but wonder how Preston would react when he saw her in something other than his oversized shirt and her tattered traveling dress. The next morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for the trip to town. Katherine dressed carefully in the russet wool dress, grateful that the high neckline and long sleeves covered most of the weight she had lost during her recovery. She braided her hair simply and pinned it up, using one of the ribbons Preston had brought to add a touch of femininity. When she emerged from the bedroom, Preston was waiting in the main room of the cabin. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and Katherine was gratified to see his eyes widen slightly. "You look." He began, then seemed to think better of whatever he had been about to say. "You look well." "Strong enough for the trip?" "Yes, thank you," Katherine replied, trying to hide her disappointment at his restrained reaction. "I'm looking forward to seeing the town properly." Preston helped her into the buckboard wagon he had prepared, making sure she was comfortably seated before climbing up beside her. The ride to Hayes City was mostly silent, but not uncomfortably so. Katherine was too engrossed in taking in the landscape to mind Preston's quiet nature. The Kansas prairie stretched in every direction, a sea of tall grasses swaying in the breeze, dotted with wildflowers. In the distance, a small herd of pronghorn antelope grazed, lifting their heads to watch the wagon pass before returning to their meal. "It's beautiful," Katherine said softly. "Different from anything I've known, but beautiful in its own way." Preston glanced at her, surprise evident on his face. "Most Easterners find it desolate." "It's vast and open," Katherine agreed, "but there's something freeing about that. In Boston, everything is crowded, buildings pressing in, people everywhere. Here you can breathe." A small smile tugged at Preston's lips. "That's exactly why I stayed. After the war, the cities felt like cages." They crested a small rise, and Hayes City came into view below them. It wasn't much compared to eastern cities, a main street with wooden buildings on either side, a few cross streets with scattered homes and businesses, a small church with a modest steeple. But to Katherine, it represented possibility, a fresh start. As they drove down the main street, Katherine became uncomfortably aware of the attention they were attracting. People stopped their activities to stare, women whispered behind gloved hands, men nodded respectfully to Preston but eyed Katherine with undisguised curiosity. "Is it always like this?" she asked quietly. Preston's jaw tightened. "No, but news of your situation has made the rounds, and as Dr. Simmons mentioned, people talk." Katherine's face burned with embarrassment. What must they think of her? As if reading her thoughts, Preston added, "Hold your head high. You've done nothing wrong. You survived what would have killed many, and you're here to take on a job few would want, teaching children who desperately need education." His words bolstered her courage, and Katherine straightened her shoulders as Preston guided the wagon to a stop in front of a modest building with a sign declaring it Hayes City School. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room structure, built of rough-hewn timber with a pitched roof. Behind it stood an even smaller building that Katherine assumed would be her living quarters. The windows of the school were indeed broken in places, and the steps to the front door sagged worryingly. "It needs work," Preston acknowledged as he helped Katherine down from the wagon. "But it's solid enough underneath. A few days' labor will make it right." Before Katherine could respond, a portly man in a suit too fine for the frontier town hurried toward them, his hand extended. "Miss Nash, a pleasure to finally meet you. Edwin Porter, mayor of Hayes City." He pumped her hand enthusiastically. "When Foster here told us you'd survived that terrible attack and were still willing to take on our little school, well, I was simply overcome. Such dedication, such spirit." "Thank you, Mayor Porter," Katherine replied, gently extracting her hand from his vigorous grip. "I'm eager to begin. May we see inside the school?" The mayor produced a key with a flourish. Of course. I must warn you, it's been vacant since winter. Needs a woman's touch, certainly." The interior of the schoolhouse was dusty and bare, with rows of rough benches facing a small teacher's desk on a raised platform. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they held only a few tattered volumes. A blackboard hung crookedly behind the desk. Despite its neglected state, Katherine could immediately see its potential. Windows along both sides would provide ample light, and once cleaned and repaired, the space would be perfectly adequate for teaching. "How many students can I expect?" she asked, running a finger through the dust on the desk. 23 at last count," Mayor Porter replied. "Ages 6 to 14, varied backgrounds, ranchers' children, shopkeepers' young ones, even a few from the outlying farms." Katherine nodded, already mentally organizing how she would arrange the space, what supplies she would need, how she would group the children by age and ability. "And my living quarters." "Right this way," the mayor said, leading them back outside and around to the small structure behind the school. The teacher's house was little more than a cabin, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area and a small bedroom. Like the school, it was dusty and neglected, but it was clean of vermin at least, and the roof appeared intact. "It's perfect," Katherine said, meaning it. After living in boarding houses and her parents' cramped home, the idea of having a space entirely her own, however modest, was appealing. Mayor Porter beamed. "Excellent. Now the ladies of the town have organized some items for you, bedding, kitchenware, and such. They're most eager to meet you. Mrs. Porter is hosting a small gathering at our home now, if you feel up to it." Katherine glanced at Preston, who nodded slightly. "A short visit would be fine." The small gathering turned out to include nearly every woman in Hayes City, all crowded into the mayor's parlor, laden with gifts and burning with curiosity about the new teacher who had survived being shot and spent 2 weeks in Preston Foster's home. Katherine endured their thinly veiled questions with as much grace as she could muster, accepting their gifts with genuine gratitude while deflecting inquiries about her time at the ranch. Preston remained just outside on the porch, declining Mrs. Porter's invitation to join them with a polite but firm refusal. After what felt like hours but was likely less than one, Katherine began to feel the strain of the day. Her side ached, and the constant barrage of attention left her exhausted. She was trying to find a polite way to excuse herself when Preston appeared in the doorway. "Miss Nash needs to rest now," he said simply. "Doctor's orders." There were murmurs of disappointment, but no one dared argue with the taciturn rancher. Katherine made her goodbyes, promising to return when she was fully recovered to properly thank everyone for their kindness. Once they were back in the wagon and headed out of town, Katherine let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you. I was beginning to think they might never let me leave." "Small towns," Preston said with a shrug. "Not much excitement, so a new face is big news, especially one with your story." "I'm not sure I like being a story," Katherine admitted. Preston glanced at her. "It'll die down once you're teaching and they get used to you. Though I can't promise the matchmaking attempts will stop." "Matchmaking?" Mrs. Porter asked me no less than 3 times if I'd met her nephew, who's arriving next month. Apparently, he's very educated and would be perfect company for our new teacher. Katherine laughed despite her fatigue. "And what did you say to that?" Something flickered across Preston's face, there and gone so quickly Katherine thought she might have imagined it. I told her you'd probably be too busy with the school to entertain suitors. A diplomatic answer, Katherine noted, and accurate. I didn't come west to find a husband. No, Preston asked, his eyes on the road ahead. Most women who come alone to places like this are either running from something or looking to marry. Perhaps I'm neither, Katherine replied. Perhaps I simply wanted to build something of my own to be useful in a place where my skills are needed. Preston was quiet for a long moment. That's admirable. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in vivid pinks and golds. Katherine was so tired she swayed slightly when Preston helped her down from the wagon. Without a word, he swept her into his arms, carrying her as easily as if she weighed nothing. I can walk, she protested weakly. You've done enough walking today, Preston replied, his voice gruff. Doctors said not to overexert yourself. Katherine wanted to argue further, but the steady rhythm of Preston's heartbeat against her ear and the gentle sway of his stride lulled her into a state of peaceful surrender. She allowed herself to rest her head against his shoulder, breathing in the now familiar scent of him: leather, horses, and something distinctly his own. He carried her into the cabin and set her carefully on the edge of the bed. Their eyes met as he straightened, and for a breathless moment Katherine thought he might say something. Instead, he cleared his throat and stepped back. Rest, he said. I'll bring you some supper later. After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Katherine removed her boots and lay back on the bed, her mind whirling with the events of the day. The town, the school, the overwhelming welcome from the ladies of Hayes City, it was all exactly what she had hoped for when she decided to come west. So why did the prospect of leaving the ranch, of leaving Preston's daily company, fill her with such reluctance? The following week passed in a blur of increasing activity as Katherine's strength returned. She began taking short walks around the ranch, familiarizing herself with the rhythm of life there. Preston taught her to feed the chickens and collect eggs, tasks she could manage without straining her healing wound. During these quiet moments working side by side, Katherine learned more about the reserved rancher. He spoke little of his past, but shared his knowledge of the land, freely pointing out different grasses and wildflowers, explaining how the cattle were rotated between pastures to prevent overgrazing, showing her how to predict weather changes by watching the behavior of animals and the movement of clouds. In turn, Katherine told him about her plans for the school, her teaching philosophy, and occasionally, stories from her life in Boston. Preston proved to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions and remembering details she mentioned in passing. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset after supper, Katherine realized with a start that she felt more at ease with this man she had known for barely 3 weeks than she had ever felt with anyone in Boston. "Penny for your thoughts," Preston said, breaking the comfortable silence. Katherine smiled. "I was just thinking how strange life can be. If those men hadn't attacked me, we would never have met. I would be teaching already, living behind the schoolhouse, and you would still be here running your ranch. You wish that had happened instead?" Preston asked, his voice carefully neutral. "No," Katherine answered honestly. "As terrible as the attack was, I can't regret the outcome. Meeting you, staying here." She hesitated, unsure how to express what she was feeling without sounding forward or foolish. Preston turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Katherine," he began, using her given name for the first time. Before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Preston was on his feet in an instant, hand moving instinctively to the gun belt he had draped over the porch railing. 2 riders approached the cabin, their silhouettes dark against the twilight sky. Katherine's heart raced, her mind flashing back to the attack on the road. "Stay here," Preston said quietly, buckling on his gun belt. The riders drew closer and Preston relaxed slightly. "It's just Harlan and Davis, my ranch hands," he explained. "Though they're supposed to be in the north pasture until tomorrow." The men dismounted, and even in the dim light, Katherine could see the urgency in their movements. "Foster," the taller one called, Got trouble. Cattle rustlers hit the Miller place last night. Sheriff's gathering men to track them. Preston's expression hardened. How many head did they take? 30 or so, the cowboy replied. And they shot old Miller when he tried to stop them. He'll live, but barely. Katherine gasped softly, and the cowboys seemed to notice her presence for the first time, touching their hats in awkward greeting. Miss, the one called Harlan acknowledged before turning back to Preston. Sheriff wants to leave at first light. Says the rustlers are headed north, probably aiming to cross into Nebraska. Preston nodded grimly. We'll be ready, get some rest, we leave at dawn. After the men departed for the bunkhouse, Preston turned to Katherine. I have to go, he said simply. Cattle rustling is taken seriously here and with Miller injured. I understand, Katherine assured him. How long will you be gone? Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be longer if the trail's difficult to follow. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Katherine had come to recognize as a sign of concern. I don't like leaving you alone, but you're healing well, and Mrs. Halloway can stay in the cabin while I'm gone. I'll be fine, Katherine said, though the thought of Preston riding out to confront dangerous men filled her with dread. Just be careful. Something in her voice made Preston pause. He stepped closer, studying her face in the last light of day. Katherine, you should prepare for tomorrow, she interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say or what she might say in return. I'll help however I can. The moment passed. Preston nodded once and headed into the cabin to gather what he would need for the journey. Katherine remained on the porch a while longer, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, trying to make sense of the emotions churning within her. When had Preston Foster become so important to her? When had his safety, his presence in her life, begun to matter so deeply? And what would happen when she inevitably left his ranch for her intended position in town? The posse departed at dawn, a group of 15 men led by Sheriff Daniels. Katherine stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching as Preston checked his saddle and weapons one final time. He had been quiet at breakfast, his mind clearly already on the trail ahead. Just before mounting his horse, he approached Katherine, his expression solemn. Mrs. Halloway will be here by noon, he said. Lock the doors at night, and there's a shotgun in the closet if you need it. I'll be fine, Katherine repeated, wishing she could erase the worry from his face. Preston hesitated, then reached into his pocket. I want you to have this, he said, pressing something into her hand. It was a small carved wooden horse, simple but beautifully crafted, fitting perfectly in her palm. I made it years ago, Preston explained, looking slightly embarrassed. Kept it as a reminder of why I came west. Freedom, open spaces, he paused. It seems right that you should have it now. The gesture touched Katherine deeply. Thank you, she whispered, closing her fingers around the small treasure. It will remind me to pray for your safe return. Something flickered in Preston's eyes, a warmth, an unspoken question. For a heartbeat, Katherine thought he might reach for her. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both polite and somehow intimate. Take care of yourself, Katherine Nash, he said softly. Then he was gone, swinging up onto his horse and riding to join the waiting posse. Katherine watched until they were nothing but distant specks on the horizon, the wooden horse clutched tightly in her hand, an inexplicable sense of loss weighing on her heart. The days of Preston's absence passed slowly. As promised, Mrs. Halloway arrived before noon and insisted on staying at the cabin, occupying Preston's room while Katherine remained in the bedroom she had used since her arrival. The older woman was cheerful company, filling the quiet ranch house with constant chatter about town gossip and her own colorful past. Under her practical guidance, Katherine continued to regain her strength, taking longer walks each day and helping with more demanding household tasks. On the 4th day after the posse's departure, Dr. Simmons paid a visit to check on Katherine's wound. Healing nicely, he pronounced after his examination. You're young and resilient, Miss Nash. I'd say you're fit enough to move to town and take up light duties at the school, provided you don't overexert yourself. The news should have delighted Katherine. It was what she had been working toward, after all, recovering her strength so she could begin teaching. Instead, she felt oddly conflicted. Perhaps I should wait until Mr. Foster returns, she suggested. To thank him properly for all he's done, Dr. Simmons and Mrs. Holloway exchanged a knowing look that Katherine pretended not to notice. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Holloway said with poorly concealed amusement. "Very proper of you to want to express your gratitude in person." That night, Katherine sat on the porch long after Mrs. Holloway had retired, watching the stars and turning the carved wooden horse over and over in her hands. The truth she had been avoiding could no longer be denied. She had developed feelings for Preston Foster. Feelings that went far beyond gratitude for his rescue and kindness. It was foolish, she knew. They had known each other barely a month. She had come west to be independent, to build a life centered around her teaching, not to fall in love with the first man who showed her kindness. Yet here she was, missing him with an intensity that frightened her, wondering if he was safe, if he was thinking of her, if he possibly felt even a fraction of what she was feeling. And even if he did, what then? Would he expect her to give up teaching to become a rancher's wife? Would he understand that the school, the children, were as important to her as his land was to him? Could there be a future where both their dreams coexisted? Katherine sighed, tucking the wooden horse into her pocket. There was no point in such speculation when Preston might not share her feelings at all. For now, she could only wait for his return and hope that, when he did come back, they might have a chance to discover what, if anything, lay between them. On the 6th day, a rider approached the ranch at breakneck speed. Katherine and Mrs. Holloway were hanging laundry when they heard the horse's hooves pounding toward the cabin. Katherine's heart leapt, thinking it might be Preston, but as the rider drew nearer, she recognized Harlan, his face grim with exhaustion. "Mrs. Holloway, Miss Nash," he called, reining his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. "The posse is returning." There was a gunfight with the rustlers. "Men wounded." Katherine's blood ran cold. "Mr. Foster," Harlan nodded grimly. "Took a bullet helping the sheriff. He's alive, but it's bad. They're bringing him in slow, should be here by nightfall." Mrs. Holloway sprang into action immediately. "We'll need hot water, bandages, whiskey for the pain. Miss Nash, clear off the kitchen table. We'll need a flat surface if the bullet has to come out." Katherine moved mechanically, her mind numb with fear. Preston wounded, possibly dying, while she had sat safely at his ranch, dreaming of a future that might never come. The irony was not lost on her, their situations reversed, her life now hanging on his survival instead of the other way around. As she prepared the cabin for Preston's arrival, Katherine found herself making silent promises to God, to the universe, to anyone who might be listening. If Preston survived, she would tell him how she felt. No more hiding behind propriety or fear of rejection. Life was too fragile, too precious to waste in silence. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Mrs. Holloway kept Katherine busy with preparations, perhaps understanding that idleness would only feed her anxiety. They boiled water, tore sheets into bandages, cleared the large kitchen table, and positioned oil lamps for maximum light. Just as the sun began to set, they heard the slow approach of multiple horses. Katherine rushed to the door, her heart in her throat, Mrs. Holloway close behind. 4 riders appeared in the gathering dusk. 3 men supported a 4th slumped in the saddle, Preston, his shirt dark with blood, his face ashen in the fading light. Sheriff Daniels and another man Katherine didn't recognize carefully lifted Preston from his horse, while the 3rd man, Davis, Preston's other ranch hand, held the reins of all 4 mounts. "Get him inside," Mrs. Holloway directed, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Straight to the table. Katherine watched in horror as they carried Preston past her. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage wrapped around his torso, and his skin had a gray cast that frightened her more than the blood. What happened? She asked, following them inside. "Ambushed us," the sheriff replied grimly as they laid Preston on the table. "Foster saw the gunman aiming for me, pushed me aside, and took the bullet himself. Damn fool saved my life, Mrs." Holloway was already cutting away Preston's shirt, revealing the ugly wound in his left side. "Bullet's still in there," went clean through, Sheriff Daniels replied. "But he's lost a lot of blood, and we rode hard at first before we realized how bad it was." Katherine moved to Preston's side, taking his hand. It was cold, clammy. "Preston," she whispered. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. For a moment his gaze was unfocused, confused. Then his eyes found Catherine's face, and something like recognition flickered across his features. "Katherine," he murmured, so softly she had to lean close to hear. "You're still here." "Of course I'm here," she replied, fighting back tears. "Where else would I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips before his eyes closed again, his hand going limp in hers. "He's just unconscious," Mrs. Halloway said quickly, seeing Catherine's panic. "Help me clean the wound. Sheriff will need the doctor." "Davis is already riding for him," Sheriff Daniels assured her. "Should be here within the hour." The next hours were a blur of activity. Katherine worked alongside Mrs. Halloway, cleaning Preston's wound, changing blood-soaked bandages, forcing small amounts of water between his lips when he briefly regained consciousness. The doctor arrived and confirmed what they already knew: the bullet had passed through Preston's side, missing vital organs but causing significant blood loss and risk of infection. "He's strong," Dr. Simmons said after examining the wound, "and the bullet took a clean path. If we can prevent infection and replace the blood he's lost, he has a good chance." "What can we do?" Katherine asked, willing to try anything. "Keep the wound clean, get broth and water into him when he's conscious, and watch for fever." The doctor packed his bag. "I'll come back tomorrow. Send for me immediately if his condition worsens." After the doctor and sheriff departed, Mrs. Halloway insisted Katherine rest while she took the first watch at Preston's bedside. Reluctantly, Katherine agreed, though she knew sleep would be impossible. In her room, she paced restlessly, the events of the day replaying in her mind. Preston had been wounded, saving another man's life, an act of selflessness consistent with everything she knew about him. The same selflessness that had prompted him to stop for a stranger left bleeding on the road, to open his home to her, to ensure she had a future in Hayes City despite her inauspicious arrival. The realization solidified what she had already begun to acknowledge: she had fallen in love with Preston Foster. Not just his handsome face or his kindness, but the essence of who he was. His quiet strength, his integrity, his capacity for compassion hidden beneath a reserved exterior. And now she might lose him before she ever had the chance to tell him. The thought was unbearable. Katherine left her room and returned to the main area of the cabin, where Preston now lay on a makeshift bed near the fireplace, Mrs. Halloway dozing in a chair beside him. "I'll sit with him," Katherine whispered, touching the older woman's shoulder. "You get some real rest." Mrs. Halloway studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Call me if there's any change." Alone with Preston, Katherine took the seat Mrs. Halloway had vacated and gently took his hand in hers. His skin was hot now, the beginnings of fever. She dipped a cloth in cool water and bathed his face, neck, and chest, speaking softly to him as she worked. "You have to fight, Preston," she murmured. "You saved my life. Don't you dare leave me with that debt unpaid." Her voice broke slightly. "Don't you dare leave me at all." Through the long night, Katherine maintained her vigil. She bathed Preston's fevered skin, changed his bandages when blood seeped through, and spoke to him, constantly telling him stories of her childhood, her dreams for the school, and finally, as dawn approached and exhaustion lowered her defenses, the truth of her feelings. "I've fallen in love with you," she confessed in the gray light of early morning, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I came west to be independent, not to lose my heart to a stubborn, heroic rancher, but here we are." She squeezed his unresponsive hand. "So you have to live, Preston Foster. Live so I can tell you properly when you can hear me. Live so you can decide if you might possibly feel something for me in return." As the sun began to rise, Preston's fever broke. Katherine felt the change in his skin, the cooling of his forehead beneath her palm. His breathing deepened, became more regular. Relief washed over her in a wave so powerful it left her trembling. Mrs. Halloway found her there an hour later, still holding Preston's hand, tears streaming silently down her face. "His fever broke," Katherine told her, wiping her cheeks. "He's sleeping naturally now, I think." The older woman checked Preston's wound and pulse, nodding in satisfaction. "You did well, child. Now it's your turn to rest. I'll watch him." This time, Katherine did not argue. She stumbled to her room, barely managing to remove her shoes before collapsing onto the bed, surrendering to the exhaustion she had been fighting all night. When she awoke, the sun was high in the sky. She had slept for hours. Panic seized her as she remembered Preston's condition, and she rushed from the bedroom, fear making her careless of her appearance. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. Preston was awake, propped up slightly on pillows, pale but alert, listening to Mrs. Halloway as she chattered about town gossip while preparing a pot of broth. His eyes found Katherine immediately, and something in his gaze made her breath catch a warmth, an intensity she had glimpsed before but never so openly displayed. "Katherine," he said, his voice weak but clear. Mrs. Halloway glanced between them and smiled knowingly. "I believe I hear the chickens need feeding," she announced to no one in particular and promptly left the cabin. Katherine moved slowly to Preston's side, suddenly acutely aware of her rumpled dress and loose hair. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," he replied with a faint smile, "but alive. Thanks to you from what Mrs. Halloway tells me." Katherine shook her head. "I only helped. Your own strength did the rest." Preston studied her face, his blue eyes serious. "You stayed." "The doctor said you were well enough to move to town days ago." "Yes, well," Katherine fumbled for words. "It didn't seem right to leave without properly thanking you for all you've done." "Is that the only reason?" Preston asked quietly. The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Katherine could evade, could retreat behind politeness and propriety as she had done before, or she could be brave as the woman who had traveled alone across the country to build a new life. "No," she admitted softly, "that's not the only reason." Preston's hand found hers, his grip weak but deliberate. "I heard you, last night when you thought I couldn't hear." His voice was low, intimate. "About falling in love with a stubborn rancher." Heat flooded Katherine's cheeks. "You were delirious with fever." "I was," Preston agreed. "But lucid enough at times, lucid enough to hear the words I've been hoping to hear since I found you on that road." Katherine's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Preston replied, wincing slightly as he shifted to look at her more directly, "that from the moment you opened your eyes in this cabin and worried about propriety while recovering from a gunshot wound, I knew you were unlike any woman I'd ever met. And every day since has only confirmed what I think I knew even then." "And what is that?" Katherine whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "That I love you, Katherine Nash," Preston said simply. "That finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, even if the circumstances were terrible. That I don't want you to leave, not for town, not ever unless it's what you truly want." Joy surged through Katherine, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "I don't want to leave," she confessed. "But my teaching, you can still teach," Preston interrupted. "We'll find a way. You could ride to town each day, or I could build a small schoolhouse closer to the ranches out this way. There are enough children nearby who can't make the trip to town regularly." The fact that he had clearly given this thought, had already been considering how to reconcile her dreams with his, touched Katherine deeply. "You do that?" she asked. "You'd help me build a school out here?" Preston squeezed her hand. "I'd do anything to make you happy, Katherine. Anything to keep you in my life, on whatever terms you set." Katherine felt tears spill down her cheeks, but made no move to wipe them away. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now that she knew they were welcomed. "I've tried to remember why I came west, but you came west to build something of your own," Preston reminded her, "to be useful where your skills are needed. That hasn't changed." He paused, grimacing slightly with pain before continuing. "I'm just asking if there might be room in that vision for me, for us." Instead of answering with words, Katherine leaned down and pressed her lips gently to his. It was a brief kiss, mindful of his injured state, but it conveyed everything words could not: her love, her commitment, her certainty. When she pulled back, Preston was smiling despite his pallor. "I'll take that as a yes." "Yes," Katherine confirmed, laughing through her tears. "But you have to promise me something. Anything?" "No more heroics," she said firmly. "No more jumping in front of bullets or rescuing strangers at great personal risk. I can't bear to lose you now that I've found you." Preston's expression grew serious. "I'll be careful," he promised. "But I can't regret what brought you to me, Katherine. That day on the road, seeing you lying there in the dust, something told me you were important. When I saw you were still breathing, it seemed like enough to justify bringing you home, caring for you. I had no idea it was just the beginning." Katherine touched his face gently, marveling at how close they had both come to death, and how those brushes with mortality had somehow led them to this moment, this love. "It is just the beginning," she assured him, "the beginning of something wonderful." 3 months later, Katherine stood beside Preston on the porch of a newly built schoolhouse, watching as children ran across the yard toward them. The small building sat on Preston's land, about halfway between his ranch house and the nearest neighboring property, making it accessible to children from several outlying farms and ranches who had previously been unable to attend school in town. Preston's arm rested comfortably around her waist, a casual intimacy they both still marveled at. His recovery had been slow but steady, and while he still favored his left side occasionally, he had returned to most of his normal activities. "Nervous?" he asked, noticing her tension as the first day of school approached. "A little," Katherine admitted. "It's one thing to teach in an established school, another to build something from nothing." "You're not building it from nothing," Preston reminded her. "You have the support of every family whose children will attend, the blessing of the town council, and a very devoted husband who happens to think you're the finest teacher west of the Mississippi." Katherine smiled, leaning into his warmth. Husband was still a new word, still sending a thrill through her when she heard it. They had married just 2 weeks earlier in a small ceremony at the Hayes City Church, with Mrs. Halloway weeping openly and the entire town in attendance. The mayor had been particularly pleased, declaring that Preston and Katherine's union represented the very spirit of the frontier: resilience, adaptation, and the triumph of love over adversity. Katherine thought it was rather grandiose phrasing for what was, at its heart, a simple truth. Two people brought together by chance and violence had found in each other exactly what they didn't know they were seeking. Mrs. Foster, called a small girl racing ahead of the other children. "I brought an apple for you, just like my pa said teachers like." Katherine knelt to accept the gift, her heart full as she looked at the eager faces of her new pupils. "Thank you, Emma, that's very thoughtful." As the children gathered around, chattering excitedly about their new school, Katherine felt Preston's hand on her shoulder, a silent message of support and pride. She covered his hand with her own, the simple gold band on her finger catching the morning light. From nearly dying alone on a dusty road to standing here, surrounded by the future she had dreamed of, and the love she hadn't dared imagine, it was a journey Katherine would never have chosen, yet one she could never regret. "You're thinking deep thoughts, Mrs. Foster," Preston murmured as the children began lining up at the schoolhouse door. Katherine smiled up at him. "I'm thinking about breathing," she said softly. "How you once told me that finding me still breathing was enough for you." Preston's eyes, so familiar now yet still capable of stealing her breath, held hers with unwavering tenderness. "It was the beginning of everything," he agreed. "But having you love me in return, that's more than enough, that's everything." As the school bell rang, calling the children to their first day of learning, Katherine stood on tiptoe to kiss her husband briefly before turning to her waiting students. Two dreams, impossibly intertwined. Two lives meant to find each other across the vast Kansas prairie. One love, strong enough to overcome the violence that had brought them together, deep enough to build a future neither had imagined possible. And as Katherine took her place at the teacher's desk, Preston's carved wooden horse sitting proudly beside her books, she knew with absolute certainty that sometimes being left for dead in the dust could lead to being found in the most profound way possible. Being found, being loved, being alive, it was more than enough. It was everything.